Okay, so welcome everybody. This is super exciting. First QWeb design tutorial. All right. So, to start off, I'm just going to introduce general topics. It's going to be a very basic design lecture here. Feel free to ask questions at any point. This is more of a chatting environment space because super passionate about this. So let's get started. All right, so principles of design, if you guys don't know already. So we have balance, contrast, emphasis, rhythm, hierarchy, white space, and unity. These are all great. Rhythm, not really used that much. But yeah, just keep these in mind as we go through the lecture. We're going to talk more about them specifically. So balance. We use this when we have even distribution in our designs. We don't want your eye to kind of go to one place and then not go to the other. It just doesn't, it adds a lot of contrast and really focuses you in the wrong place. So design is a very important thing for unity. There's different types. There's symmetric, asymmetric, radial, and mosaic. I think it's pretty obvious from the photos what they kind of are, but we'll dive into it. So symmetric is the first one. It's basically, it's like when you were in school and you had the mirror and you had to draw the shape on one side and see it reflected on the other. That's basically what symmetric is. I don't typically use this one often because art is all about drawing attention to a certain place and drawing your focus to a certain aspect, and then you want to lead them across the page. And I find in this case, you're just kind of looking in the middle and you don't really know what to look at. So I don't really use symmetric balance a lot, especially in this case. This is an example of a website where they used symmetric design. However, I'm just flip-flopping between the pigs and not really paying attention to anything. So I wouldn't really use this technique. The next one is asymmetric, which is the one that I use a lot. It's not completely symmetrical. However, you have even components on either side. So say you had a square on one side and a circle on the other, but they have the same kind of structure, so it'll balance out. So like this, we have the title, and you have like the orange background over there that you look at, and you kind of, it's like a C shape that you kind of follow. So that would be asymmetrical design. Next, we have radial balance. This one's not used very often at all, just because it draws your attention to one specific point and nowhere else throughout the page. This is an example. We couldn't really find an example for a website because it's not really used that much. But it's generally used for buttons and highlighting certain things on a website. Next, we have mosaic. I like to call it organized chaos. I'll flip to the example here. So it's used for blogs. It's just really, you have a component and then you kind of copy and paste it throughout the page. They use it a lot for like quotes and memorial kind of stuff on certain website pages. But this was just an example that we pulled. So yeah, it's a lot of repetition and just kind of using the same thing over and over again. All right, so in summary, we got, if you have no balance, then you have no unity on your page. And the most common are symmetrical, asymmetrical, and mosaic. Just a little tip, remember that, because we have a Kahoot after this. All right, so the next design principle is contrast. There's 4 categories: color, size, shape, and typography. These are very important, and contrast can make or break a design. Yes, yep. Yeah. So let's start with color. So contrast to color, I use this one a lot when I'm making websites, graphics, designs, anything. It's just such an easy way to get your attention to something. So call to actions, here, like the contrast of color is really in your face. this is a perfect example. So the get started button is in your face. You're like, okay, I know what to do here on this page. You always want to give your users something to do, and you want to highlight that action to do. So it's very important. Next is contrast of size. Always remember that the biggest thing on the page is what you're going to look at first. And the smaller the item, the less important it's considered. QWeb? Yeah. All right. So an example would be this QWeb website. So obviously you look at the container first and the text, then you kind of branch over to chocolate chip cookie dough, and then follow through the page. So this is a great example of forcing the eye to look over there, and then you kind of flow through everything else. Yeah. Then we have contrast of shape. This one's a little difficult to kind of implement because not many circles are used on websites. But this is an example. It's very chaotic. I'm not a huge fan of the contrast on this one. However, the point of this photo is the circles in the background, contrasting with the square here. Kind of makes you focus on different elements of the website. So just keep that in mind when you're designing. The next one is contrast of typography. This one can get very interesting because fonts, like there's so many different ones. So always be careful when you're choosing certain fonts, and you want to make sure that, well, your viewers can actually read them. This is an example. So they have 2 different fonts on the page. Well, 3 if you count the little text. But it separates what's going on. So you have color contrast with the push the world, and then you have text contrast, well, typography with brands forward. So this is a great example, and you can see it kind of breaks the page up. So in summary, there's a very fine line for contrast. You shouldn't implement every single concept I just went over into one design. I'd choose like 2, 3 max, especially when it comes to one singular component on a website. All designs are broken up into like components, sections. All designs are broken up into components, sections. So just make sure that for each thing and area that you're designing, you only implement a few. You're good, you're good. Yeah. So here's a few bad examples. Personally, the rainbow one is my favorite. Yeah, and then I'd say that this one is a little too little. I think a pop of color, or maybe putting them in boxes, would kind of accentuate what you're supposed to be looking at. And then that one is, I have no words for that. Don't design like that. So the next we're going to talk about color theory. Does anyone have any questions so far? No? Okay. Okay, so as you guys probably learned in art class, these are the color wheels. You have primary colors, secondary colors, and tertiary colors. Few things about primary colors: they can't be made by any other colors. That's one of the main components. And then secondary colors are made using primary colors, and then so on. The key thing about colors is it's important to understand their background. So then when you're designing, you kind of know the color palettes to choose, and what works with what. And also, pulling on my design experience, I've worked as a UI UX developer and designer. And it's also really neat because you're looking at what if the user is colorblind? What if they have other disabilities and they can't see certain things? So it's important to make sure that you have enough contrast, but you're not overloading the page like we saw before. So color harmony secrets. So there are a few. Here we have analogous colors. So on the color wheel, basically they're just beside each other. So it could be like orange and then like yellow and green. I don't know why these are all purple, but generally it's more wider spread. But basically it's 3 colors on the color wheel side by side. And then one in particular is generally the focal point. So I'd say if you had orange, yellow, and green, I'd say yellow would be your highlighted color. Yeah, and then you have complementary colors. That's an error. Which are just on either side of the color wheel for opposites. This is kind of the easiest one. I'd say the most common color combo that you find is purple and orange, just because green and red is Christmas. Yeah, and just be careful of that kind of environment as well. You don't want to represent something, color scheme that means something. So careful with the rainbows. And then we have neutral colors, which honestly is my starting point whenever I'm designing. I always use off-white and off-black whenever I'm designing, and then I kind of build my colors on top of that. Yeah.
For complementary colors, is there like a limit that you'd recommend as to how many you're adding to your website's palette?
Yeah, I do mention it a little later, but in the color palette, I'd say you should have like white, black, gray, and then a base color and then an accent color in your designs. So that's kind of the format. I show it later in the presentation. Yeah. And then we have color context. This kind of goes back to the color blindness, making sure that there's enough contrast, then your users can actually read it. And certain colors really pop with one another, so orange and purple, but then when you put it on, say, orange and red, it doesn't really work that much. So you want to choose a color palette where you can put any color combo together and they all work for text and absolutely anything. So just keep that in mind. And then this is an example of a huge color pop. They chose kind of a funky color for the website, but I think it honestly works. And then they used a rainbow as like their accent color is what I would say. And their main color is that toned yellow. And then their text color is black. So here's the color palette that I was going to talk about. So this is actually the palette that I used for the new QWeb website that I designed. So you have the main color, which is the blue, and then you have the accent color. You can see like I highlighted it as focus hover color. And then you have the main text color and then off-white. Just keep in mind, you never want to put white on a website. You'll destroy your user's eyes. Don't do that, especially now that white backgrounds are a huge thing. I'd honestly use like a really light gray. And then black, never put straight black. Always make it off black. You can just pull the bar down a little bit so you're not straining your eyes. And then we're going to talk about typography. Honestly, I'm not going to talk much about it. There is a link provided in the slides that we'll share. There's not much to say about it. Just know that there's different fonts, different sizes, weights, forms, structures, textures, color, and direction. So when choosing a font, it's important to portray what you're trying to say through the font. So don't choose like calligraphy for some tech company. I wouldn't really recommend. Or if you're gaming and you choose like a very curly artsy font, I wouldn't really say that that's gonna fit either. So here's a few crazy fonts that I don't recommend. Yeah, I think one of my favorites is Rubik's Beastly. It's just really funny to read. But yeah, don't use any of these on your website. So yeah. Yeah. Pretty obvious why you don't use them. Yeah, so then the topics that we covered today was design principles, color theory, and typography. Does anyone have any questions? Yes.
About typography, for actually selecting a font during like
Yes.
the mock-up process, is there like a streamlined way that UI UX do it? Because usually I just go one by one on like Figma until I find something, but that's
Me too.
okay.
I mean, there are certain like styles of fonts that they're grouped into, which the link provides and kind of goes in more detail. It's just there's so much, so I don't even want to try to portray it. It's better just read it. But yeah, there's different styles of fonts. Like if you want curly font, I just Google them and it kind of, I'm just like, okay, I'm looking for this. It generally matches the vibe that you're kind of going for. But yeah, I basically just go on Figma and I just keep scrolling. And then I Google what they look like. But yeah. So does anyone have any questions about design, making anything? Yeah.
How many fonts is too much? Like, would you say 3 is a lot, or like?
I'd say normally on a design you have like, if you're making a website, for example, I'd say the title could be like a drastic font, and then your text and everything else should just be one font. So I'd say like 2 should be pretty good. Yeah.
Over how to choose your color since you have your baseline.
Yeah. So if we go back to the slides here. So here, so when I was designing the QWeb website, I started with black and then off black, off white, sorry. And then when you choose the other 2 colors, you can use any of the kind of color palettes that we talked about. So like neutrals, anything like that. Most of the time I veer towards like the blues just because they're really calming. And then I choose a exciting color. So often they use like blue and then orange because they're complementary. So.
And you're saying it's good to like stay away from the pure white background.
Yeah, well, I mean, when you have an all white screen, it's just very intense. Yeah.
Do you have any advice for coloring buttons? I feel like there's a sort of balance between not having any color at all versus like
Yeah.
a really gross saturated color.
That is very true. For buttons, they're a little difficult because generally like a company has like a color palette and you kind of like have to play with that. But when you're coming up with your own, I'd say that blue is not a call to action color. I'd say like red, orange. I'd say like warm colors I kind of stick to because you immediately look there. And like, for example, the green, I didn't use that for buttons though, because that's really intense. So I'd say like if you had like a lighter green that you could put black text over, that's not as intense. I'd say that would be a button color as well. Does that answer your question? Sort of? Okay. Yeah.
So you said like blue is calming. So like, is there any other color that has like similar properties or like other like what would red mean, for example?
I'd say red is very aggressive. Like each color has their own meaning. So generally when you look at companies, it's kind of interesting because when you look at companies and their logos, the colors actually mean something. So red is actually considered cheap because McDonald's, you got the red and yellow, all that kind of stuff. So there's a lot of background and research that actually goes into choosing color logos. And then you also have like the like industry kind of colors. So if you're doing AI, for example, like all the super techie colors are like neon green, and you got like the light blue and all that kind of stuff. So that's where I got our logo from, was kind of techie. But yeah, back to what you were saying is like you have calming colors, which are like the blues, purples, and that kind of stuff. And you have like the angry colors, which are like the warmer ones, so like yellow, orange, and red. I generally use one of the cooler ones and then one of the warmer ones and kind of put them together because it kind of balances up. Yeah. Does anyone else have any questions? Yeah.
Not for me, or maybe not, maybe it is, but how do you think somebody who's never even touched design should sort of get into it? Like
yeah.
Technologies and like what should they start looking into?
Yeah. Honestly, I go on to Pinterest and I search up a whole bunch of like, I just literally type in like UI designs, UX designs. By the way, UI UX stands for user interface, user experience. We're gonna have further tutorials, and I'm gonna actually go through the process of how to design a website later, closer to our development sprint. So if you guys are interested in that, like, please feel free to respond on Discord. But yeah, when you're first getting into it, I go on Figma, like I'll literally show. So this is how I created our logo. Wow, this is really delayed. So basically how you start is you find colors that you like, kind of just put them together. So I went on Pinterest and just searched up color palettes for AI, and this is what came up. So then I dragged my favorite ones into here. As you can tell, like we got the blue, that's very common. And then this is where I got the green from. And then I just kind of like combined my thoughts into a list. And then when it comes to like logos and choosing that kind of stuff, again, I just do my research, and because it was Queens, I just searched up a whole bunch of Queens logos, and then you search up like tech. So basically you have like your research that you start out with, and then you make a whole ton of mockups. Don't be afraid of how many you make. It's part of the process. And then you only end up using one. But yeah, don't be intimidated by that. That is completely normal, and I've almost wanted to hit delete on almost every single one of those. But it's a part of the design process. So yeah, when you get into it, I say like, what I did was I went onto club Instagram pages and I tried to recreate all of their posts. That's kind of how I got into it, actually. So like CompSA, for example, the biggest computing club, I went onto their website and in Figma, which is what this is, I tried to recreate those posts, and they kind of like learn the balance and learn everything. So feel free to use QWeb posts to kind of play around with that. We'll also have a Figma tutorial later on, so feel free to come to that as well. But yeah. Anyone else have any questions? Yeah.
What are some sources that you use to like, even like know how to start out and what?
Like you mean like how to use some tools, or
Like how to do like that as well, but like the entire work.
oh, how I okay. All right, got your question. Okay. To be honest, I got into it when I was a developer at a company, and I saw this designer sitting at a very comfy chair by a window, and I was like, whatever that is, I want to do that. Because I'm sitting here in my corner, I'm like, what is this? And I just saw their screen, and then they gave me a few links. I don't know if they exist anymore. They were really crappy. And there were a bunch of design games that I went on to, which we're gonna have a design game night. So like, come out to that, guys. It's gonna be super fun. And that's kind of how I got into it. Again, like learning how to do it, I just research UI UX design and kind of just piece it together from there. It's like an art form, basically. This is the People Watching Club website that my team also designed. Shout out to my team. And here's the first page. I won't spoil the whole thing, but basically where you start is I start with the color palette and the logo, and then you kind of just work it from there. You kind of get the vibe. This is very humorous, by the way. This is really funny. And then say I'm approaching like a website kind of structure, I just start placing like blocks. So I'm like, okay, titles here. And I generally just on a piece of paper, I know it's very archaic, but I get a pencil and I just like block out like title, image, arrows for carousel, header, logos here. Like I sketch it as if you were in like visual like art. Yeah. And then you find your inspirational websites. So Apple is a huge one of mine. And you go on and you just kind of look at the layout that they have. It's a lot about replicating what people have and then adding your twist onto it. you're like, nah, I think it should go here. And then you just, it's perspective. Yeah.
I'm just wondering if you're going to be posting more advanced tutorials, such as like integrating your design to make it actually feasible to make.
Yeah,
for, like,
we're,
websites.
yeah. We're gonna do a website design tutorial. Like I'm gonna actually like make a website in front of you guys. So you'll see that.
How important would you say Photoshop skills are to your like job and position today?
It varies. It depends on what you're trying to accomplish. Like for here, Figma, I generally just would put shapes together. And then say I had an image, I'd hop on 5 seconds for Photoshop. So it's good to know and it's good practice, I'd say, but it's not generally used in profession. Unless you're editing actual photos as a job. Yeah.
Are there plans for tutorials on like using things like Figma? Because I know to use it like very basically, but I don't know if you said like lay out multiple pages. I feel like that would be useful to know.
Yeah, that'll be part of the website tutorial. This is a very basic, if you can tell, tutorial. We were just trying to gauge interest, and thank you guys so much for coming out. I really appreciate it. Does anyone else have any other questions? It could be about professions in the fields, developers, anything at all. Yeah.
I guess a professional question is like, how did you go about finding a job for your UX?
Yeah. LinkedIn. But on a more serious note, I actually started out as a developer. I still am. I'm applying right now. But I then sat beside a few designers and they're very chatty. You get to know them and you're like, hey, can I take some of your workload? And they're like, yeah, sure. So that's kind of how I got it. If you're in comp sci, like you can get that developer, get the money, you know, and then you can talk to them, reach out to them, and they're happy to give you stuff because they don't like doing work. But that's how I did it. Any other questions? No? All right. I think we'll start the Kahoot. We have a gift card here, guys. So some big money. All right. Let's stop sharing.